John Malcolm joins me now, who's vice president of the Institute for Constitutional Government at the Heritage Foundation. John, welcome back to the program.
Hi, Lars. It's dizzying, all the things that are going on in the area of police reform.
It is. I've got some great producers who work with me who are quite a bit younger than me, and I said, file all this away in your memory bank because you are probably never in your life going to see an America that sees so much change coming at it all at once. So make sure you kind of file this away and remember it, because it's not just another news year. There's always news year in and year out, but this year there are so many things coming at us: riots, China virus, now reforms to police, or the defunding of police. So tell me about this executive order and what it promises to do, the one that the president signed yesterday.
Sure. And I should add that even since then, today, the Republicans in the Senate have dropped their own crime reform proposal called the Justice Act that Tim Scott is sort of leading the way. But the president's executive order, of course, is more limited in terms of what it is that he can do without legislation. It's, in my opinion, a very good step in the right direction. So he calls, for instance, for the Attorney General to establish credentialing for police departments based on, sort of best practices, and to prioritize funding for organizations that seek out training for those best practices and seek to be credentialed. One thing that all of these bills, with the exception of the people who want to defund or dismantle the police department, appears to have in common is a call for greater transparency and accountability by police forces. And the president's executive order deals with that, too. He calls for the Attorney General to establish a database so that in fully adjudicated cases, so after due process has been provided, appeal rights have been exhausted, fully adjudicated cases in which a police officer has been found to have used excessive force would be placed into a database accessible to law enforcement so that a bad cop can't simply move from one department to another, covering up their record. Aggregate data would be made available to the public. The president also is going to provide training for things like de-escalation techniques. He calls for a ban on chokeholds unless deadly force is permitted. So if somebody's attacking a police officer feels that he could be killed or suffer grievous bodily injury, he can then use a chokehold. But other than that, it is banned. But the de-escalation techniques, for instance, will include dealing with people who are homeless or suffering from substance abuse or mental disorders. It's a corresponder program in which the police, when confronting these individuals who can either be victims or perpetrators of crime, will, whenever possible, bring along social workers who, of course, trained in de-escalation techniques, help calm these people down. And, of course, if that fails, the police officer will be there. And then there's other calls for potential legislation for additional grants to do things like covering recruitment and retention of high-performing officers, and also to provide for better community engagement, including potentially some funding for nonprofit organizations in communities that aid in that effort. So it's very positive steps in the right direction, a far cry, of course, from dismantling or defunding police organizations, but I think would definitely help the situation.
John, since you're at the Institute for Constitutional Government, let me ask you a constitutional question. The president really and the federal government shouldn't really have much more than that to say about how local policing is done, should they? Most of the biggest decisions should be local, should they not?
No, that's right. So, other than federal law enforcement officers, DEA, FBI, et cetera, and they're actually very small in comparison to police forces. The 10th Amendment provides states with basically police powers to protect the health, safety, and welfare of residents within those states, and it gives them broad authority as to how to conduct those operations. And there are thousands of police forces, everything from maybe a dozen people in some small towns to the NYPD, which has over 36,000 officers. So really, the federal government gets a lot of information. They develop a lot of expertise. They can promulgate best practices. They can use federal funding to incentivize the states to adopt some of these measures, providing aid to those who do, withholding aid to those who don't. But primarily the ability to control police forces and their practices are at the state and local level, and that's probably a good thing. They have great
and that's where the failures are as well, is it not, John? That's where the failures are happening, and many of them in cities run by liberal Democrats. I mean, I have to bring politics into it in that case, because when you hear Minneapolis say, why we've got to get rid of these awful police departments filled with, virulent racists and systemic racism, you wonder, well, you folks have been in charge in that city and that state for a long, long time. Atlanta, somewhat the same situation. So why haven't you fixed this problem? It seems they want to dump the problem on the federal government the same way they wanted to dump China virus on the federal government, even though public health, first line for public health is states, not the federal government.
Yeah, no, look, that is certainly true in a lot of major urban areas, Chicago, but certainly other areas, and now what's going on in Seattle. The president has no control over that. Those are local officials, many of whom are Democrats, and the police forces are largely appointed by Democrat, mayors. I don't happen to believe that police forces are systemically racist.
I don't either.
Americans serving, right? But certainly the conduct of police officials and fighting crime are local concerns, and in major urban areas, it's also true that many of those elected officials happen to be Democrats.
How about this? Is there any point to, say, getting rid of police unions? FDR didn't believe in public employee unions. Should we get rid of the police unions if they're one of the reasons that bad cops are kept on the payroll?
Well, I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Well, I don't either, but I had to ask.
Yeah. Well, look, it's one thing for the police unions to go in there and negotiate salaries and benefits, but there's no question that the police unions have taken on an outsized role in terms of developing arbitration rights and making internal investigations very difficult against police officers. And now there are a lot of people who are pointing out that because of these procedures that have all been negotiated by police unions, there are a lot of police forces that are forced to hire back onto their staffs, frequently with awards of back pay to some pretty bad officers. I don't see anybody at the moment at least in any of these executive orders or legislation, calling for major reforms to police proposals. But I certainly think that is something that ought to be looked at.
Well, John, I appreciate you coming on, because the idea of some national standards, if you say to a state, look, you can have your own local standards on top of these, but we can make the floor. A cop has to be this good to be on the payroll, has to have this kind of training. I know for some of the smaller departments it may be very tough, but if they start defunding police departments, saying we're going to give you fewer resources, if anybody thinks that's going to mean more training for officers rather than less training for officers, I think they haven't looked at local government very hard. That's John Malcolm, who's with the Institute for Constitutional Government at the Heritage Foundation. John, thanks very much.